Before we dive into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.
You're so cheap, David. Always pinching pennies while everyone else lives. Karen snapped across the living room, and laughter ricocheted off the holiday lights like thrown glass. My mother Sandra tutting into her napkin. My father Robert's face a hard little fossil of something that might have been shame, and my son Michael trying to look away. My daughter Emily whispering to Thomas like a chorus of small, sharp knives. My name is David Mercer. I'm 44, and I'm from Akron, Ohio. And that handful of facts sat in my chest, the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river until you decide whether to hold it or let it go. The sentence started everything, not because it was new or clever, but because it landed in front of everyone I loved and flattened me into a shape they could study. And the way they studied me was with the same casual economy I'd learned to practice at work. Skim the surface, take what you need, never account for the toll. I could have laughed it off. I could have told Corinne to sit down, to stop, to take the cheap shot and let whatever the two of us had left survive in private. But the laughter made the wound look theatrical, and when your life has been a private ledger of sacrifices, you begin to measure wounds by the witnesses. That night the living room smelled like pine and cheap candles and the roast burning at the edges, because I'd been on a call with a client until 1/4 past dinner, shifting numbers in my head while the kitchen grew a little more smoke. My hands were still faintly slick with the office coffee I'd gulped in the car, and I remember the shape of my wallet in my jacket, the extra cards, the receipts I keep in a pocket, as if the paper could prove I tried, and the way Michael's eyes glanced at the tags I'd painstakingly folded to hide prices, as if I were the one who should be embarrassed that I couldn't buy them the world. It was petty the way it started, a used car after a lease ended that year, the cheaper model of the phone at Michael's insistence that it's just fine, Dad, the off-brand coat Emily wore, because they had grown itself into a language we used to talk about me, smallness, prudence, thrift, and those words became ammunition in a family that had only ever understood love in terms of receipts and appearances. Corinne's cousin, Melissa, who had flown in from Columbus with 2 glossy shopping bags and a laugh like a glass door slamming, made some bright comment about keeping up with the Harveys down the street, and everyone leaned into it. Somewhere between the stuffing and the cranberry sauce, they had decided there was a measurable scale of worth, and I was at the bottom. And that evening, when my sister-in-law said, "You deserve better than what he brings," it was less consolation and more verdict. The humiliation wasn't one dramatic blow so much as the slow unspooling of all the ways I'd been small to them, performed publicly and dressed as truth. I could see it, the way neighbors' eyes skimmed my shoes at the threshold, the way Karen's smile had the practiced tilt of a woman who learned to be polite in the presence of money. And at some point, between the jingle of ornaments and my father clearing his throat to change the subject, the room shifted from being a place where we celebrated a holiday to a tribunal. I remember thinking absurdly that I'd done my calculations correctly. Overtime in the spring, 2 weekend shifts in the summer, a second job in October stocking shelves at the hardware store for cash when a client's check was late. I remember paying for repairs I didn't mention, sneaking presents into closets, wrapping them in midnight after everyone was asleep, telling myself that the quiet sacrifice was its own kind of dignity. And then I really heard them, when Corinne and Melissa went into the kitchen and thought the dining room's walls were soundproof. He does all this? For what? He works himself to death to buy us this? Melissa said, voice a low ribbon of scorn, and Corinne laughed, a brittle thing, and said, he buys cheaperies. He thinks ostentation is grease money. He's so proud of being frugal that he forgot how to be anything else. The word sheep landed like a spike. I had paid late fees so the utilities wouldn't be cut off, bought a used furnace filter because the brand name models were out of our reach that month, wrapped 3 presents, and pretended there were 8. In the ledger of my life, every penny had a name beside it, and now those pennies were being called shameful. I could have left that night. I could have taken the gifts and driven until every light in the house was a receding star, but I stayed, because staying had been my religion, and because I wanted, perhaps more than I wanted dignity, to see the faces of the people I loved when they opened what I had bought. I wanted them to be surprised. I wanted them to see how much I had stretched for them, to behold the arc of compromises that had, in my head, built this family. The gifts were not lavish by anyone's standard. They were careful selections, items that matched small confessions they'd made over plates and late-night TV. An insulated thermos for Robert, who liked to sit on the porch at dawn, with a cigarette tucked like a ritual between fingers. A set of cozy throws for Sandra, whose arthritis tightened in the winter. A watch for Michael that meant, I think you are responsible. A leather-bound journal for Emily with a fountain pen tucked into the strap, because she'd once said writing made the noise stop. I had wrapped them with trembling fingers. I had rehearsed what I would say. I had put my dignity into tissue and tape and boughs and arranged them under the tree like offerings. Instead, they had arranged a verdict. The next morning, the presents I had bought stayed under the pine, heavy and silent, while small talk turned to other people's promotions, other people's cars, other people's vacations. The truth is that humiliation doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be witnessed, and when everyone else is busy with the ritual of consumption, it's easy for them to frame another man's thrift as moral failure. So I did the only thing that felt like control. I listened. I learned their timing, their jokes, the micro-expressions that rolled across Karen's face when she wanted to be kind, but had rehearsed a crueler edge. I learned that Michael considered a man in a suit at the PTA meeting a kind of prince, that Emily had started to take from friends the more fashionable jackets that made her pictures look like other people's lives. I learned that my parents had begun to measure me in comparison to my brother Thomas, who had moved to the city and bought an espresso machine and a weekend apartment, and had learned to make his suburban holidays look like glossy postcards. Thomas's wife, Lillian, whose laugh was oily with philanthropy and whose holidays came with matching monograms, had become the standard. The insults hardened into a rhythm, a backhanded compliment at Thanksgiving, an offhand comment at a cousin's birthday, the way Corinne would say, "We'll do better next year, Dave," with a sweetness that tasted like a bandage over an announcer's tone. When you are the person who pays and the people you pay for mock the check, the sum of those little acts becomes a kind of theft. They steal the meaning of what you do for them until the gift itself is worthless. It was not only their words, it was the way they'd started to expect my capitulation, as if my love for them had been a line of credit, and they were entitled to run it dry. Each time I fixed a leaky roof or missed a concert, because a deadline at work meant I had to take it, a door closed behind me that no apology could reopen. I remember once, months earlier, being at the hardware store with Thomas when he said, loud enough for the clerk to hear. He's always the one who pays at the end. It's like David's job is to make us look good. I felt like a houseplant being openly discussed in a living room, present, serving a function easy to water and then to ignore. That comment lodged like a splinter, and my hands would itch to pull it out, but I didn't. I doubled down. I took extra shifts. I ate cereal 3 nights in a row to save for a camera Emily wanted for the photos she insisted would change her life. I refused a night out with a friend to stay and make the mortgage payment 1 month early, because Robert's checkups had a new copay and Sandra's pills had gone up. I believed stubbornly that commitment meant erasing myself when it hurt, and that love was the sum of the missing things. In my private ledger, there was dignity in being invisible, because I thought I was buying them the version of the world they wanted. Then came the year when the strain showed like mildew. The company I worked for cut back, and my bonus, the one I'd counted on to cover the holiday budget, evaporated overnight. I folded the shock into my routine. I picked up a weekend at the bakery, selling bread and sweeping floors, while dawn clung like a bruise. I told myself the sacrifice would pay off because I could, as always, rearrange the numbers until the presents appeared under the tree. I did the math on borrowed time. Defer the dentist until spring, skip my annual checkup. Say yes to a job that meant less sleep. The night I found the box of return slips tucked behind a casserole dish in our pantry, I felt a dull electric current through my hands, as if the house itself were a live wire. I had thought the slips were for shoes mistakenly ordered, for the small misfits that happen in any family's commerce. Instead, I found post-its, a child's handwriting that wasn't mine, notes like David's gifts were silly, and a precise list of which items they'd been saving to rewrap for charity or swap with friends for something better. In the very center of that mess was a folded note, not written to me but about me, that said, "He doesn't understand real giving. We need to keep up." The paper didn't just name me. It attempted to redefine me. That night I slept on the couch in a house that felt too large for my body, because the living room seemed to stretch like a stage, and everyone in it had learned lines that left me a prop. My decision to stay wasn't courage. It was fear of the unknown, the slow consumption of what kept us tethered, family, habit, the comfortable horror of being known. But when Corinne's cousin, Melissa, the one who always had a new pair of shoes and an apartment whose photos she posted like sermonettes, asked Corinne, in front of the whole family, "Isn't it time he started earning us better?" And the sentence landed like a gavel. Something in me loosened. I began to plan not in the private arithmetic of how to stretch a paycheck, but in the cold, bright numbers of consequence. The plan was not complicated. I would take back the offerings I'd made. I would reclaim what I had given and stop giving. It felt at once like a crying and a prayer, because I had been bankrolled into invisibility for so long that the smallest act of self-preservation had the shock value of a revolution. I didn't want theatrics. I didn't want the drama of slamming doors and yelling in the foyer. I wanted to do it cleanly, surgically, remove the bloodied thing and let the wound scar. So in January, when the post-holiday return window opened and the stores still smelled faintly of pine, I went to every merchant who'd issued a tag showing my card. I remembered the faces of the clerks, a woman with a child's drawing taped behind the counter, a man with a bandaged thumb who asked if I wanted a bag. They treated me like any other customer, scanning the barcodes and handing me back envelopes of refund slips that felt like small, bright judgments. I felt oddly no guilt for returning the gifts themselves because the guilt had been spent a dozen times over by their contempt. I did not announce what I was doing. I did not leave a note in the middle of the living room. I slid the envelopes into my coat pockets and drove to the bank, walked inside with the worn leather of my winter jacket still smelling of pine sap, and put the refunds into an account that was not for them. After the purchases were reversed, I closed the credit lines that the family sometimes relied on for the extras, the unexpected repairs, the last-minute travel to a funeral across the state. I arranged automatic payments to stop. There was a private ecstasy in pressing a button and watching a string of numbers blink to zero, not cruelty so much as the final arithmetic of dignity. That spring, when the spring came late and the lawn was still full of dead leaves, I told Karen I was taking a break from funding the family discretionary fund. She laughed as if I were joking and then went to her mother and said, "He's being dramatic," and they all rallied around each other at the idea that my withdrawal was a mood rather than a boundary. They had always been good at framing my actions as temperament rather than truth, so I escalated in small, quiet ways. I refused to pick up a check at a family dinner when the habit was to split or to let them read my credit card like a public utility. I suggested we scale back on presents in favor of experiences that didn't require money. They looked at me like someone who had suggested we eat wallpaper. I took fewer calls from Corinne when she wanted to unload about bills and more calls from my mother when she genuinely asked about my health. Sandra's voice on the other end of the line sometimes had the same gentleness it had when I was a boy who'd scraped his knee, a tenderness that hadn't yet learned to disapprove. The household felt the change like a weather front, subtle at first, then undeniable. People began to call with varying strategies to attempt to lure me back. Corinne would text a GIF with a heart, small performances of affection that doubled as a plea, while others used different bargaining chips, guilt, humor, threats, thinly veiled. Thomas called once, more bluntly, with the sort of brotherly admonishment that doubles as a dare. "You know how Mom gets. Don't be a hero who ruins the party." I told him I'd done the math and that there was no more party to fund. He told me I was being selfish. I told him I was being honest. The house grew colder in terms of warmth, because heat had always been part of my bill, and now the thermostat became a metaphor. The first Christmas after I'd returned the gifts and stopped underwriting their lifestyle, the calendar sat like a calendar has to. Dates marked, plans penciled. I thought the space between us would be a chance to reset, to negotiate value without money as the language. But money had become their grammar, and they spoke it fluently. When December rolled around, the invitation started like pebbles thrown at a pond. A text from Sandra asking if I'd pop in for cocoa. A message from Michael calling to hang while we put the tree up. Emily sending a glittered photo of a wreath with the caption, "Can't wait for you." I told myself I would go. I believed for a moment in the soft possibility of ordinary reconnection. Then I watched them. The way Karen's face lit up when a neighbor mentioned Thomas's new stereo. The way Melissa curated her Instagram with trip photos that made other people's kitchens look threadbare. The old rhythms returned. They were stunned I could say no, but also confident I would not. So I did not go on the evening they arranged to surprise me with the rest of the family. I left a card on the table that said, simply, "I will not be there," because absence had begun to feel like the only honest form of presence I could afford. I powered down my phone that night and climbed into my car, with a duffel bag and a plan that had been small and cold and then grew bright with possibility. I would travel. I would go to places where people did not confuse my decency for a credit line. I booked a flight on a Tuesday for Friday, a red-eye to New York, a connecting flight eastward, then south, and my chest buzzed with a terror that felt like freedom. I had never taken more than a week at a time for myself in a decade. Vacations had been something for other people's calendars, a luxury between corporate responsibilities. I had never thought of traveling alone as an act of reclamation, but when you have spent so long purchasing other people's smiles, the idea of buying yourself a seat on a plane becomes subversive. I called in sick to the second job with an explanation that sounded plausible and walked through my house one last time. It was small things I noticed: a mug with a chipped rim that had belonged to Sandra, a photograph on the mantel where we all smiled less because we weren't the camera's honest subject anymore, the nod of the Christmas lights in the attic that no hands had yet taken down. I left a note by the tree, not angry but precise. I returned the gifts. I'm away. The note was not a declaration, but an inventory. It said more with what it omitted than it could with words. The next year their house sat with a tree that held the memory of ornaments rather than ornaments themselves. The night the first landed in Rome was incandescent. A sky the color of a coin, a city that was both ancient and relentless. I walked streets that smelled of bread and diesel and someone's cigarette, and I felt the first blow of real air in months. I met a bar owner named Marco who poured an espresso with the kind of care that felt like reverence. He asked me offhand why a man my age would come alone at Christmas, and I told him the truth in pieces, that I'd been invisible among people who called me cheap, and that I wanted to see what it felt like to be valued by strangers who wanted me for my company rather than my bank card. Marco laughed in a way that read like relief, as if a man being honest was rare and therefore nourishing. Here we are poor, and we make rich things of wine and jokes, he said. And when he put a plate of warm, oily olives in front of me, I felt something like return. I kept traveling. I went to Lisbon and drank with a woman named Ana, who had the job of guiding ships into harbor, and the kind of laugh that made the idea of my fear seem comical and small. I spent an evening in Marrakesh where a tailor mended a tear in my coat without asking for money, telling me instead a story that wound around his life and left me with the sense that gifts can be human rather than transactional. I found people who paid for me in conversation and who valued the things I had thought were worthless: reliability, kindness, and ability to listen without turning the conversation into an account. I took photographs without expectation that turned up in my phone months later and made me wonder at the man I was becoming, a man whose presence did not equal a ledger entry. Meanwhile, back home, the fallout was a slow domestic rot. I received calls that were at first annoyed. "Where are you? You left us with nothing." And then pleading, "We need you, Dave," and finally apologetic in the way people become when their choices have been confronted by consequence. Corinne sent messages that danced between indifference and outrage. She posted pictures of a gilded breakfast with the caption, "Trying a new way this year," and then a week later called to say casually, "The tree's not the same without you, you know," as if she were naming a fact rather than confessing a loss. Robert called to ask about a repair, and in his voice I heard the small, delicate unspooling of someone trying not to beg. Thomas, who had always been able to borrow my patience as though it were an inheritance, texted with a strategy. "Come home and let's talk. We'll fix this. We love you." I would return polite, blunt messages. "I'm well. I'm not coming back for Christmas this year." Each reply felt like a small surgery in which something that had scabbed open again and then closed was reopened by their need. My brother once tried to guilt me by listing the ways the family would miss me in the rectangular way families list absences. "Emily's going to miss the camera. Mom will miss you in the kitchen. Dad will miss his morning coffee with you." I wrote back, "You can miss me or you can ask me to come back on their terms. You can't have both." The world I had been maintaining, mortgage, car, motherhood's unvoiced needs, continued without my underwriting in the small mechanical ways we don't think of until they stop. A filter not changed, a furnace unchecked, a light left on. The family started to exchange the language of inconvenience for the language of emergency. The emergency had a way of cutting through social facades and forcing the raw truth into the open. Corinne called one afternoon in March because the water heater had gone, and she mentioned, in that clipped way women have when they are rehearsing an argument, that if I could find a way to help, she'd appreciate it. I didn't. I sent a single check that covered half, and not with tenderness, but with the detachment of someone who had read the ledger and decided the account was closed. They accused me of cruelty. I was accused more than once of being selfish. In their telling, my choosing myself was the ultimate narcissism. That accusation stung because I had spent decades hiding my wants in the basement of my life, and when I brought them up again, suddenly they were called vanity. My travels did not erase the ache. There were nights in hostels when I wished for a bowl of my mother's soup, and there were postcard-perfect vistas when I wanted to pick up a call from Emily and hear her voice discuss nothing at all. But there were also nights when someone bought me dinner and meant it without expecting anything later, and there were mornings when a stranger's gratitude for my help with directions felt like a small flint that ignited something in me. That being present without cost was not only possible, it was renewing. Over time, their attempts to draw me back took on a theatrical desperation. Sandra came to visit me in Chennai, unannounced, thinking the distance might be a lever, and finding instead someone who had already rebuilt his idea of home. She sat across from me in a hotel lobby and asked quietly for my forgiveness, saying, "We didn't know what it cost you, Dave." And for a second I saw her as I had seen her as a child, soft as bread. Forgiveness was not mine to grant as a public favor. I told her that forgiveness was a slow thing, and that admitting error did not fix the economics of years. She cried, not dramatically, but the kind of sob that undid someone who had hidden their cares in the creases of other people's lives. They came at me with different strategies after that, apologies that personified guilt, offers of therapy that felt more like damage control, the stark truth of marriage counselors who said the word enmeshment as if that would absolve them. Corinne wrote me a long letter that tried to map out the hurt she'd felt at what she called my sudden withdrawal, but it read to me like a recipe for negotiation rather than an admission. She listed in careful pen all the ways my absence had hurt the family, and then, underlined, asked me to come home and be the man we remember. I folded the paper and took it to a cafe where the barista, noticing my hands shake, asked if I wanted extra foam. I didn't want to be the man they remembered. I wanted to be the man I was becoming. Time, oddly, was my ally. Months hardened into a new rhythm, and with distance came clarity. My absence changed their holidays in ways more severe than they had imagined. Cousins who'd expected to borrow my decor suddenly realized the living room looked different without the man who'd always put up the lights. Sandra's arthritis improved slightly because chores were redistributed. And Michael, who'd learned to depend on the material ease I provided, grew into a man who, in the face of emptiness, started to shop for second-hand gifts and to take pride in the labor that made someone feel seen. There were apologies along the way, and there were attempts to rewrite the record, small public gestures on social media, curated photos with captions that said, "Missing family." They tried, in their way, to reconstruct me into the version that fit their nostalgia, the guy who would do anything to keep things tidy for the holidays. But what I had learned during my exile on trains and foreign sidewalks was not merely that I could breathe without their approval. It was that leaving had made them face the hard truth that their comfort had been subsidized by my invisibility. The ultimate cruelty, or perhaps the most effective education, was that when people don't have what they expect, they begin to see their expectations for what they are. The next Christmas, I was in Kyoto with a group of people who were strangers 3 weeks before, and family-level gentle by the time winter's thin air arrived. We ate noodles in a tiny restaurant where the owner put her hand on my shoulder when I ordered something unusual, proud of my selection, and we walked through gardens where the trees were trimmed like thoughts. On the day my phone lit up with missed calls, I looked at the screen and let it ring. When I finally answered, it was my sister-in-law, Melissa, voice small, using more words than she'd ever used intimately. "It's just not the same, Dave. We didn't understand how much you carried." She'd come late to understanding, as many people do, but the late arrival of comprehension is not the same as restitution. I sent a message that had no anger, only the last of my boundaries. "I'm happy. I'm with people who value me." It was both a statement and a closing. Months later, when I did go back for a visit, not for Christmas, but in an ordinary season, the house felt like a museum of choices. The tree was there that year, sparse and tenacious, a reminder of the season when everyone had assumed my labor would be endless. The family had tried to recreate the warm glow with cheap lights and do-it-yourself ornaments, and there was a bitterness in the way they looked at each other, like a band pulling taut to avoid slack. They were divided, each of them trying to claim moral high ground or emotional injury in a way that felt small and petty given the stakes. Holidays, stripped of an operator, reveal not the machine, but the people who used it. I sat with them at dinner and listened rather than performed. They asked the predictable questions. "Where have you been? Did you find yourself?" I answered in the manner of someone who had been asking himself the same questions in the hum of trains and hotel lobbies. I found people who wanted me for me. I found work that didn't require I erase myself to be useful. The looks on their faces were a complicated map of relief and shame and a tiny, defeated arrogance. They would always be who they had been, because changing is harder than blaming. The consequences, finally, arrived like a slow justice. Corinne went to her sister's house one afternoon and found no one there who would loan a hand. She found that invitations she used to take for granted required polite negotiation now. Thomas had to sell a stereo he'd bought on impulse when the money he'd expected me to cover for shared expenses didn't materialize. The stereo went to a pawn shop, whose clerk asked if they were sure about parting with it. Michael, who had once straightened my tie with the sort of familiarity that comes with dependence, started taking shifts at the bookstore to buy gifts that were thoughtful because they were bought with earned money. They swore to each other sometimes in that way families do when they're scared of losing a thread, that they had learned their lesson, and learning lessons in the warm glow of a home that had once been subsidized by another's quiet labor felt insufficient. I watched them reconstruct their life with the brittle grace of people who'd been told they must grow and then had to choose between growth and the comfort of repetition. My own life didn't become an epic of joy. It became, slowly and steadily, the accumulation of small reliances with people who paid me in gratitude rather than entitlement. I rented a small apartment in a city by the coast for a while and filled it with books and the photographs I'd taken. No trophies, only images of markets and faces and streets. I built friendships that had the honest friction of equal exchange. I paid for dinners that felt like investments rather than taxes. There were losses. I missed birthdays and graduations and the small disasters of family life. There were gains. I learned to love a mirror that reflected a man who valued himself. As the years edged on, the family tried reconciliation in fits and starts. Sandra wrote letters that said we were cruel in ways we did not see, and Robert, with his soft, slow voice, left a voicemail that confessed he had been proud of me once and then learned to compare instead. Corinne finally, in a moment that felt like both a confession and a plea, called me and said, "We are trying to be better. Come back for Thanksgiving." I thought about it and didn't answer for a long time, because coming back for a meal felt like submitting to a test I had already failed and passed. I told her instead that I was booked that week, that plans had been made, and I suggested she come visit me. She didn't. In the end, the final humiliation, the one that became the fulcrum, everyone could not stop talking about at holiday parties and on neighborhood forums, was less theatrical than you might think. They kept the tree up all year. It began as an attempt to keep hope alive, a tiny click of light to ward off the months, and turned into an obsession that made the house smell perpetually like November. It wasn't a conscious punishment, but the light in a deserted house takes on the aspect of accusation. They'd put the tree in the living room and lit it on November 1st, and when December came, people would come by and snap photographs against its steady glow, and the room looked as if it had been staged for something that would never come. The man who had once arranged the lights was gone, and the tree that acted like a prosthetic could not replace his presence. The neighbors whispered, and then they stopped whispering and instead posted, "They're coping." And the family learned what public sorrow looks like, a performance only the afflicted can see as real. I watched it all from a distance for a while until one winter evening, when I flew back for a quick visit and found the house quiet as a church after service. I opened the front door and the hush hit like cold water. The tree was in the corner, gaunt and stubborn. The ornaments hung with once familiar hands, the lights dimmed as if sighing. Corinne sat on the couch, older in the way people get older when their roles are no longer fierce. She was folding napkins, and her hands trembled when she looked up at me. There was a kind of ruin in her face that told me she had been struck by what she had set in motion, the loss of the person who had made holidays possible, and insight only after the ledgers closed. She looked at me, and for a long second she had nothing to say because the words that used to calculate other people's worth had failed her. Then she said so quietly I almost missed it, "We were wrong." The phrase was small and enormous at once. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't balm in the way I would have needed, but it was true. In the silence that followed her admission, a dozen small consequences unfurled. Thomas's stereo listing in the paper, a box of unsold ornaments at Melissa's fundraiser, Michael's resolution to work through college rather than wait for a check, Sandra's new habit of walking instead of driving to save gas, and to feel the cold in her bones rather than the shame of asking. The ruin of the betrayer, the person who had taken me for granted, was not a dramatic loss of everything in one crowing second. It was the slow unmaking of assumptions and the dawning of humility. They had to remake themselves without my quiet labor, because the world had learned that my presence was not a right, but a gift. I could have said then and there 1,000 smart lines. This is what you made, or you will learn. But I wanted the final line to be something clean, unambiguous, and small enough to be carried as a clip on someone's phone, because that is how modern justice often travels, in a trimmed sentence shared and reshared until its meaning becomes a kind of currency. So I stood up, walked to the tree, touched an ornament that had once been my favorite, because it was hand-painted by Emily when she was little, and I felt the tremor of belonging and loss cross me like weather. I looked at Corinne and the rest of them in that hushed room, and I said a sentence that was not mean but not conciliatory either. It sealed nothing, but it told the truth plainly, the way truth ought to be spoken when you've unlearned the language of buying people and learned instead the language of boundaries. This is your Christmas without me.
Betrayal leaves scars, but sometimes it also leaves lessons. What lesson did this story leave with you? Share it in the comments, and let's see how many of us have walked through the same kind of fire. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one.